A very quiet affair. A short story. Chapter 1. I had not meant to stay in Singapore more than a week, but the East has a way of detaining a man who comes to it after many years, like a casual caller who finds himself drawn into a household's forgotten habits. The harbour, with its forest of masts and funnels, the heavy smell of spices and oil upon the water, the dark, cool corridors of the old hotel where the punkahs still swung lazily from the ceiling, all conspired to remind me that there had been a time when I had fancied myself almost a denizen of these parts. I had arrived on a steamer from Batavia with the vague intention of going on to Penang, but on the first evening an acquaintance sent word to ask me to dine at the club, and thus it was that my journey was postponed. The club stood on a rise overlooking the harbour. From its veranda one saw the road curving along the sea, lit here and there by the oil lamps of food stalls, and beyond that the slow procession of lights moving across the straits, where steamers passed towards Hong Kong or down to Australia. The air was thick and warm and smelt of seaweed and wet earth, for it had rained in the afternoon, and the punkahs creaked rhythmically over the long dining room. As I entered, a voice called my name with that heartiness which in England would have seemed excessive, but which in those latitudes passes for ordinary civility. It was Henry Davenant, whom I had not seen for 20 years. He had been in those days a lean, energetic man with a sharp nose and close-cropped fair hair. Now he was stout, his hair quite white, his neck thick and red above the soft collar of his dinner shirt. He had retired from the service, he told me, but he could not bring himself to return to England for more than a few months at a time. The damp of Sussex oppressed him, and he had grown too used to the sun. His laugh was loud, his gestures expansive, and yet I detected in his eyes that faint, weary irony which I have so often observed in men who have spent their lives administering distant provinces and governing races whose ways they have never quite understood. We dined together, and during that first hour we spoke of the inevitable things, of old colleagues long since gone home to be buried in country churchyards, of younger men I remembered as subordinates who now occupied high posts, of the changes that had taken place in the town. "They've pulled down half of what you knew," he said, waving his hand towards the windows. "There used to be gardens where there are offices now. And you remember the row of bungalows along the shore? Only one or two left. We're dinosaurs, old man. The world is in a hurry." After dinner we took our brandy and cigars out onto the veranda. The night was very still. The lamps in the harbour showed in long trembling streaks upon the water. Somewhere in the compound a gardener was watering the plants, and the smell of damp earth rose up, mingling curiously with the faint odour of disinfectant from within the club. A punkah coolie dozed on his mat in a corner, his feet bare, the rope loosely caught in his fingers. I leaned on the balustrade and listened to the muted city. The occasional rattle of a carriage, a far-off cry in Chinese, the hoot of a steamer. Henry joined me, his cigar glowing in the dark. "Do you see that light there?" he said suddenly, pointing towards a dimly lit curve of the coastline where a few scattered lamps showed among trees. "Just beyond the point?" I could distinguish nothing very clearly, only a suggestion of palms and roofs against the paler sky. "More or less," I answered. "There was a bungalow there once," he went on. "A very pretty place in its day. Veranda all round, with bougainvillea climbing up the pillars, and a garden that went right down to the water. The sea used to come up almost to the steps at high tide. I haven't been out that way for years. It's no doubt a garage now, or a go-down, but I sometimes fancy I can still see it." I knew that tone in his voice. It is one I have found often in men of his kind when the evening is advanced and the bottle nearly empty. It means that some story, carefully folded and laid away in the mind like a suit of clothes long out of fashion, is about to be brought out. I did not press him. I only waited. He smoked in silence for a little, then sighed. "There was a couple who lived there when I first came down from Kedah," he said. "Carstairs was the man's name, Edward Carstairs. Do you remember him?" I shook my head. The name meant nothing to me. "No, you wouldn't," he said. "He was never in the limelight. A capable fellow, conscientious, steady, not the sort that makes a splash. His wife was a pretty little thing. I suppose she'd be in her 60s now if she's still alive. I haven't heard of her in years. Funny, when you Come to think of it, how people who once filled your horizon can vanish as completely as though the sea had closed over them. He flicked the ash from his cigar, and his eyes went back to that stretch of shadowy coastline. There was an unpleasant business, he added in a different tone. We're not supposed to talk about such things. It isn't done. Damned bad form and all that. But sometimes I think if one doesn't talk, one goes mad. The older one grows, the more the dead insist upon one's attention. They tap at the window panes like bats. Do you know, I have sometimes wondered whether any of us behaves well when the right temptation presents itself. We muddle through somehow and call it virtue because we've been spared an awkward choice. Carstairs was an honest man. One would have said that nothing could ever shake his integrity. And yet, he broke off and took a deep draught of his brandy as though he had gone further than he had meant to. I said nothing. I have discovered that those who are inclined to confide will do so without coaxing if only one supplies the silence in which their memories can arrange themselves. Presently he laughed shortly. It's an old story now, he said. More than 30 years. No one concerned is likely to care what an old fool like me remembers. If you're not bored, I'll tell you how it happened. You used to write things, didn't you? Perhaps one day you'll make something of it. Though I doubt whether anyone at home would understand. They think in terms of tea on the lawn and village cricket. They don't know what it's like out here when the rain beats on the roof for days, and the rivers rise and carry away whole villages, and a man finds himself alone with his conscience and the smell of mildew. He signaled for another brandy and settled himself in his chair, facing the dark horizon where the invisible bungalow seemed to hover like a ghost. The waiter withdrew with a soft patter of bare feet. The punkah creaked, the night insects hummed in the garden, and Henry, after a moment's pause as though choosing his point of departure, began his tale. Chapter 2. When Carstairs first came to Tanamera, he was 35 and had been in the service for 12 years, which is to say that he had long since given up any illusion he might once have had of reforming the world. He had begun, like many young men, by regarding his appointment as a kind of chivalrous mission. He had read books of travel and accounts of explorers, and had pictured himself as bringing order and justice to wild places that had never known them. The rice fields and mangrove swamps of his first posting had soon disabused him. By the time he was transferred to the port, he had settled into a dry, cautious efficiency that endeared him to his superiors and bored his colleagues. He was a man of medium height, with a thin, fair moustache and a forehead already retreating. His eyes were pale grey and rather short-sighted, and he had a habit of pushing his glasses up on his nose when he was thinking. He kept his clothes scrupulously neat, even in the heat of the afternoon, and his bungalow was the only one in the station whose books were properly dusted. Until he married, he had lived almost ascetically. He worked late, wrote long dispatches, and drank less than anyone at the club. When the service grapevine announced that he was engaged to be married, there was some mild surprise. The bride was a girl from a provincial town in England, the daughter of a clergyman who had left his family with little but his books. Her name was Margaret, though everyone came to call her Meg. She had grown up in a vicarage with thin curtains and frayed rugs, where the smell of boiled cabbage never quite left the dining room, and holidays consisted of walking in the rain along the grey seafront of a neighbouring resort. An aunt of hers had married a man in the colonies. It was at that aunt's house that she met Carstairs when he was on leave. He was, to her, a figure endowed with a certain glamour. He spoke of palm trees and crocodiles and native ceremonies, of journeys by launch up rivers that smelt of mud and orchids, of nights when the forest glittered with fireflies as though strewn with stars. He did so dryly, in his precise manner, almost as though reading from a report. But her imagination supplied the colour and romance that were lacking in his tone. She was not beautiful in any striking way, but she had a freshness, a delicacy of feature that charmed. Her brown hair curled readily in the damp. Her eyes were large and expressive. There was something eager and uncertain about her that appealed to a man of his age, who had grown used to the company of other men and to the unimaginative faces of officials' wives. She was 22 when they married, faintly bewildered by the swiftness with which her life had altered, by the sudden necessity of choosing luggage for a climate she could not picture, of saying goodbye to the small circle of friends and relatives who assumed that she had done very well for herself, and said so with that mixture of envy and congratulation which people reserve for those whose fate they do not altogether envy. The journey out was an adventure. She stood on the deck as the ship left Southampton and watched England fade into a bluish haze, thinking that at last something was beginning. In Suez, she was dazzled by the glare and the noise. In Colombo, she bought lengths of vivid silk she would never wear. Carstairs was kind and attentive, if somewhat awkward. He took care that she did not overheat, that she rested in the afternoons, that she had what he considered suitable reading. He was fond of guidebooks and annual reports. She preferred novels in which people said witty things to one another in drawing rooms. They arrived at Tanah Merah at the end of the rains. From the launch, she saw the town climbing up from the water. Warehouses painted a mournful grey, a row of Chinese shophouses with peeling blue shutters, the white club with its veranda and ragged flag, and above them all a hill on which a few bungalows perched among trees. The air smelt of mud and cloves. A fat Malay boatman waited at the landing stage with a pony cart to take them up to their new home. The bungalow that had been prepared for them seemed to Meg like a house in a dream. It was built on stilts, with a broad veranda running all round it. The roof of corrugated iron blazed in the sun, but inside the rooms were shadowy and cool. There were rattan chairs with cushions in faded chintz, mats on the plank floors, a dining table with a few pieces of indifferent silver, and a bookcase containing Carstairs' modest collection. The boy stood at the top of the steps, barefoot and impassive, making a vague salaam. Someone had placed a bowl of frangipani on the table. Their heavy, sweet scent filled the room. "It's not much," Carstairs said with an apologetic gesture, "but we'll make it comfortable." To Meg, after the gloomy vicarage, it seemed almost luxurious. She moved about it with an excitement she tried not to show, opening shutters to admit the view, touching the unfamiliar objects, marveling at the sight of the sea beyond the hibiscus hedge, at the coconut palms with their tufted heads against the sky. The first weeks were full. There were calls to pay and return, little dinners at the club, drives along the shore in the cool of the evening. The other women took stock of her and found her harmless. She was neither clever enough to threaten them, nor pretty enough to disturb their husbands. They taught her how to manage servants, how to guard against fever, how to avoid offending the Chinese merchants who supplied them with provisions. She learnt that the flowers which had charmed her at first stained everything they touched, and that the ants would invade a cupboard if a grain of sugar escaped the bowl. The heat oppressed her at midday so that she lay on the long chair in the drawing room and felt too languid even to turn the pages of a book. Yet for a time she was happy, or thought herself so. There is a period in such marriages when the novelty of the surroundings, the small responsibilities of housekeeping, the merely practical problems of living in a strange land serve to occupy the mind and hide from it the fact that it is not otherwise engaged. It was later, when the routines had established themselves, when she could find her way about the market without wondering at the naked children playing in the gutter and the old Chinese men sitting in doorways with their pipes, that the days began to stretch before her in a monotonous vista. Carstairs, whose work had grown more exacting since the extension of the railway and the increase of trade, spent long hours at the office. He took the affairs of the district seriously. There were land disputes to settle, the perennial questions about tithes and taxes, the interminable reports to write. He came home for tiffin, commonly in a hurry, and then returned to the office until the evening, when he would dress punctiliously for the club and expect her to accompany him. At first she went willingly enough. It amused her to sit on the veranda with a gin pahet in her hand and listen to the talk of the men, most of which she did not fully understand. But after a while the jokes seemed always the same, the news from home always a little out of date. The very faces at the next table, flushed from sun and whiskey, took on the sameness that comes from perpetual proximity. She began to read more, rummaging among the old magazines in the club library for stories that hinted at a life in which people felt in a way that made sense to her. It was then, when the first enchantment of the new had faded and the old life seemed infinitely remote, that Dr. Philip Ames arrived in the station. Chapter 3. He was younger than the others, not yet 30, and he came out under some scheme that sent fresh medical officers to the smaller ports where the senior men were unwilling to go. Ownership of his own luggage lent him a certain air of independence. He had a battered violin case and a typewriter that he carried himself rather than consigned to the coolies, and with that instinctive wariness of new blood which men in a small community have, the others at the club watched him with curiosity. He was tall and thin, with dark hair that would not lie flat, and spectacles that he pushed up on his forehead when he listened to someone speak. There was something hesitating in his manner, as though he were not quite sure of his place in this world of older, more emphatic men, yet his shyness had in it no civility. He had come, he told them, from a hospital in the East End of London, where he had seen more misery than he cared to recall. The post in the tropics had seemed an escape as well as a promotion. On his first Sunday in the station, he called at the bungalow as duty required. Meg received him in the drawing room, dressed in a cotton frock that the heat had already begun to wilt. The boy brought in lemonade, and they sat awkwardly for a few minutes while Ames, who had not yet learnt the small, easy formulae of colonial politeness, tried to find something to say. It was Meg who broke the ice by asking about London. She had not seen the city since a hurried day of shopping before her departure, when she had been too flustered to take in more than a blur of noise and traffic. Ames spoke of the fog, of the terrible cold of the previous winter, of the crowds in Piccadilly on Sunday afternoons. As he talked, he forgot his embarrassment. His hands moved, his eyes lit up behind the glasses. She listened with a kind of hunger, asking trivial questions whose very triviality betrayed her need. Did he ever go to the theatre? Which plays had he seen? Were the parks very beautiful in the spring? It amused him, perhaps, to find someone who cared to hear of such things. Among the men at the club, he had soon discovered that England was spoken of chiefly in connection with salmon, schools, and the state of the House of Lords. Before he left, he noticed the books on the table and remarked upon one of them, a novel which, for all his seriousness, he had read on the voyage. Meg's face brightened. She too had read it, and in her isolation she had not expected to find anyone in Tanamera who knew it even by name. "Come again," she said almost impulsively as he rose to go. "My husband is often late at the office, and I am generally alone in the afternoons." He thanked her and went away down the steps, the sun glaring on his bare head, his long figure curiously incongruous among the hibiscus and the crotons. It was some days before he came again. The duties of the little hospital kept him occupied. There was a case of smallpox in a village up the river, and he had to go there in a launch that smelt of petrol and stale water, to vaccinate the people and persuade them to submit to measures they mistrusted. The old dresser who had served the previous doctor regarded him with suspicion, and the Chinese apothecary, who supplied medicines, attempted to charge him double for everything, assuming that he knew no better. But there came an afternoon when, released early by the happy accident of a cancelled clinic and driven from his quarters by the oppressive heat, he found himself turning almost unconsciously towards the hill. The boy, when he knocked, took his hat with the impassive gravity of his kind. Meg was on the veranda, sewing. She looked up quickly, and he saw that she had been listening to the cicadas with that particular face people wear when they are afraid of their own thoughts. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," he said. "But you told me—" "You're not disturbing me in the least," she answered. "I was only wondering whether the world outside the garden still existed." He laughed and sat down. The talk, which at their first meeting had been stiff, now came more readily. He told her about the hospital, the absurdities of the regulations, the obstinacy of a Malay headman who had insisted on putting betel nut juice on a child's sores. She told him of the small feuds among the ladies of the station, of the infinite tact required to keep the boy from leaving when he was in one of his sulks. It was ordinary talk, the harmless chatter of acquaintances, and yet when he went away, the sun low in a sky pale with heat, he was conscious of a feeling he had not expected to find in Tanamera, that of having been understood. He came again and again. Soon it became a habit. In that little world where everyone knew who came up the hill and when, his visits could not pass unnoticed. The ladies, whose ingenuity in such matters is inexhaustible, observed the pattern of his steps, and Mia, the ayah from the resident's house, made certain remarks in the bazaar which spread with that celerity which gossip has in places where there is nothing else to occupy the mind. Meg, who was innocent in the technical sense that she had never before been courted, was not at first aware of anything unusual in her friendship with Ames. She felt more alive when he was there, that was all. When he sat on the veranda rail, hat in hand, and argued with her about a book, when his laughter broke the heavy stillness of the afternoon, when he spoke of other worlds than the one bounded by the club, the hospital, and the market, she felt as though a window had been opened in a room she had not known was stifling. That Carstairs should be jealous of such conversation did not occur to her. He had no interest in the novels they discussed, and as long as his dinner was punctual and his shirts properly ironed, he was content. Yet little by little lines were drawn, as lines always are when two people find that they think of one another in the moments between their meetings. Ames would glance up at the bungalow when he passed below on his way to the hospital, with a quick, unacknowledged hope of seeing a white dress among the shadows. Meg, hearing footsteps on the path, would lay down her book and listen, her heart giving a foolish little flutter if the steps turned up the drive. Once, at a tennis party at the club, when the sun was low and a faint breeze had sprung up from the sea, she slipped on the rough gravel and would have fallen if Ames had not caught her. His hand closed on her arm. For a second, her body swayed against his. It was a trivial incident, quickly over, but afterwards, when she lay in bed and the moonlight filtered through the mosquito net, she felt again the pressure of his fingers, the muscular strength of his arm, and her own helplessness as she had lost her footing. To a woman whose life has so far been composed of small duties and small pleasures, such a moment may seem disproportionately significant. The mind, having little nourishment, feeds greedily on crumbs. One evening the rain came. It descended suddenly with that violence peculiar to the tropics, blotting out the view beyond the garden as though the world ended at the hibiscus hedge. Carstairs had been called away that afternoon to a village 20 miles inland where there was some dispute about a road. He was not expected back until the following day. Meg sat in the drawing-room with the lamp turned low, listening to the thunder rolling among the hills and the incessant drumming of the water on the iron roof. The boy had gone to the servants' quarters. The house felt strangely empty. She had a book in her hand, but she had not turned a page for half an hour. When the knock came at the door, she started violently. For a second, she thought it might be her husband returned unexpectedly, and her heart, without her consent, leapt in a small, guilty panic. When the boy opened, Dr. Ames stood there, his clothes drenched, his hair plastered to his forehead. He had been caught in the storm on his way back from the hospital and had turned instinctively up the hill, knowing that the bungalow was nearer than his own quarters. Meg, her first fright past, was chiefly concerned for his health. She made him come in, found dry things of Carstairs for him to put on, sent the boy to brew hot tea. He emerged presently from the spare room, looking faintly absurd in Carstairs's clothes, which were too short in the leg and too broad in the shoulders. They laughed over his appearance, and the laughter, prolonging itself perhaps beyond the occasion, took on something strained and breathless. The storm showed no signs of abating. The rain fell in sheets. The lightning flickered incessantly. It would have been folly for Ames to attempt to go down the hill in such a deluge. The path would be a torrent, the drains overflowing. "You must stay to dinner," Meg said. "There's more than enough." She tried, as she said it, to hear her own voice as someone else might hear it, but it sounded perfectly ordinary, sensible. They dined together at the round table with its stiff white cloth, the punkah flapping lazily, the lamp sputtering in the draughts. It was in no way a romantic meal. The soup was tepid, the curry too hot. The boy broke a plate and stood looking miserable. And yet, when they had finished and gone back into the drawing-room, bringing the lamp with them, there was between them a feeling that something had altered without either of them being able to say when. The house was ringed with darkness and thunder. The lamplight made a little island in which their faces appeared, curiously distinct against the shadows. They talked at first of trivialities, then of more personal things, of Meg's childhood in the vicarage, of Ames's student days, of hopes they had once had and laid aside. It is a dangerous thing for two people drawn to one another to speak of what they have not had. The imagination, once awakened, is a subtle architect. There came a pause in the talk. Ames sat leaning forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped. Meg, in the long chair, had ceased to feign interest in her sewing. The silence was filled with the sound of the rain. "You mustn't come so often," she said suddenly in a low voice. "People will talk." He looked up quickly. "Do you care what they say?" "My husband would care," she answered. "He is a just man." "Is that worse than being an unjust one?" he asked, with a bitter little smile. She hesitated. "It is more difficult," she said at last. He rose and stood by the table, his hand resting on the back of a chair. The lamplight threw his shadow large upon the wall. "If I come here, it is because I cannot help it," he said. "If it is wrong, tell me so plainly and I will stay away. But don't tell me that it is merely inconvenient. I am not a boy. I know what I am doing. Do you?" She felt the color rising to her cheeks. She was angry with him for forcing the matter into words and angry with herself because those words were the ones she had been secretly uttering in her own mind. "You have no right," she began, but her voice shook. "No right to say that no right to love you," he interrupted. The word, spoken at last, lay between them like a live thing. She had a confused impression that the room had grown suddenly smaller, that the air was thick and difficult to breathe. For a moment neither moved. Outside, the thunder crashed and a gust of wind rattled the shutters. She ought, she knew, to have replied firmly, to have told him that he was mistaken, that he must leave at once and never come again. It would have been the sensible, the decorous thing. Instead, she found herself saying in a voice scarcely audible, "You must go now, Philip." He did not obey at once. He took a step towards her, then stopped, wrestling visibly with some impulse he feared. At last he bowed his head. "Very well," he said. "I am a fool, but not such a fool as to force myself where I am not wanted." The formality of the phrase gave her courage. "It isn't that you are not wanted," she said. And even as she spoke, she realized the fatalness of the admission. Their eyes met. He came to her quickly then, knelt beside the long chair and took her hands in his. She did not resist. What passed between them in that moment was very simple, and yet it altered the course of their lives. When at last the rain slackened and he went away down the hill in borrowed clothes, the path still glistening with water, Meg stood on the veranda, her hand on the damp rail, and watched until the darkness swallowed him. The air was cool now, the sky patched here and there with stars. Behind her, the house waited, silent, with that peculiar stillness rooms have after something irrevocable has been said within them. Chapter 4. If the world were ordered according to the expectations of the righteous, the discovery of such a secret would be followed promptly by punishment or at least by ruin. The guilty would be found out, the betrayed husband would storm, and the erring wife would depart, suitably chastened, for some obscure boarding house in Europe. Life, however, is not so obliging. It allows men and women to remain for astonishing lengths of time in the positions from which, according to all moralists, they ought to be removed. For weeks after that night, nothing outwardly changed in Tanah Merah. The sun rose and baked the streets. The Chinese shopkeepers drowsed in their doorways. The Malays punted their boats up and down the muddy river, and in the bungalow on the hill the servants went about their tasks with the same indolent efficiency. Carstairs went daily to his office, Ames to his hospital. At the club in the evening, whiskey and soda were consumed, gossip circulated, small scandals were magnified and then forgotten. Meg and Ames had not, after that first surrender, plunged recklessly into a passionate intrigue. They were both too deeply imbued with a certain tradition of restraint for that. Indeed, the very consciousness of what they had done made them more cautious. Their meetings became rarer, not more frequent. When they met, it was under the ordinary conditions of station life, in the presence of others, at tennis or dinner. But if the occasions were fewer, they were the more charged with significance. A glance across the table, a phrase that could be read either as trivial or as a personal allusion, a momentary touch of the hand as Meg passed him a plate, sufficed to remind them of the bond between them. They lived henceforward in that state which perhaps more than any other tests the fibre of a character, the state of secret complicity under the eyes of the unsuspecting. It would be idle to pretend that they did not at times contrive to see one another alone. There are always plausible pretexts. Meg had taken an interest, partly sincere and partly adopted as a form of self-defense, in the women's ward of the hospital. It was natural that she should visit it from time to time, bringing magazines and small delicacies for the patients. Ames would show her round with a proper professional manner, but there were corners, verandas, storerooms, where a few moments' privacy might be snatched. Those moments, stolen in the midst of bandages and disinfectant, had a curious poignancy. There is something almost indecent about passion in a setting consecrated to pain and healing. It heightens both the guilt and the sweetness of the encounter. Once, when a child in the ward moaned in its sleep as they stood close, Meg broke away from him and went to the bed, her face pale. "We are monsters," she whispered later when they stood at the door. "No," he answered stubbornly, "we are only human. That is the misfortune." If they had been less scrupulous, their affair might have run a quicker, more violent course and ended in equally violent catastrophe. Their very consciences prolonged it. Each told himself, and sometimes the other, that they must break it off, that it could not go on. And each day found some reason why the parting should be postponed. Meg could not bear to hurt Philip by a brusque dismissal. Philip could not bear to abandon her to a life which now seemed to him unbearably arid. Meanwhile, Carstairs remained in ignorance, or appeared to do so. It is astonishing how little one sees of those one lives with, if one's attention is absorbed elsewhere. He noticed, perhaps, that Meg was more animated than she had been, that she took more trouble with her clothes, that she had opinions about matters on which she had formerly been indifferent. He may even have remarked with satisfaction that she seemed to be adapting herself at last to the life in Tanah Merah. If any shadow of suspicion crossed his mind, he put it aside as unworthy. He was not a man given to jealousy, regarding it as a sign of vulgarity. The first hint that the situation was less secure than they had supposed came, not from any failure of their own discretion, but from the busy malice of others. One evening, as Ames sat in the lounge of the club, a drink in his hand, he heard his own name in a conversation at the next table. Two of the married women of the station were talking with an air of mysterious relish. They lowered their voices when he drew nearer, but not before he had caught the words, "much too often at the bungalow" and "poor Carstairs." Of the two women, one was of the excessively virtuous type, which conceals envy under indignation. The other, having once narrowly escaped scandal herself, had ever since been unforgiving of those who ran any risk at all. Ames turned away, his ears burning. He left the club early and walked up and down the road outside for a long time, tormented by thoughts in which indignation at their prying combined with a sharper panic. For gossip, once started in such a community, is like a fire in dry grass. That night he wrote a letter to Meg, a long, confused letter in which he implored her to let him go away before things became impossible. He would apply for a transfer. There were stations inland where a doctor was needed. He would leave Tanah Merah, he said, without seeing her again. It would be better so. He was very earnest, very noble, and wholly unaware that his nobility would wound her. The letter reached her the next morning, brought by a small boy who was in the habit of carrying notes between the hospital and the bungalow. She read it in her room, her heart contracting with each line. It had not occurred to her that he might solve their dilemma by removing himself. She had assumed, rather, that the solution lay in some sort of painful but inevitable renunciation on her part. The prospect of his absence, of the days stretching before her empty of that particular tension which, however cruel, had made them vivid, filled her with a dismay she tried to disguise to herself as indignation. In the afternoon, when the heat was at its height, she put on her hat and walked down the hill, disregarding the boy's offer to fetch the carriage. She found Ames in his office, surrounded by papers. The apothecary peered at her curiously from his corner, then slipped out, leaving them alone. "I had your letter," she said without preamble. "I was mad when I wrote it," he said, pushing his hand through his hair. "But perhaps the madness was a kind of sanity. You know what they're saying." "I know what they are capable of saying," she answered. "Do you think their talk matters more than what we feel?" He made a gesture of despair. "It matters to your husband," he said. to your reputation, to your whole life. You may despise these women, but they can hurt you. And you? She asked gently. Can they not hurt you too? I am a man, he said with the rough egoism of his sex. It is different. If necessary, I can go away. You wish to go away then? She interrupted. That is what you are trying to tell me? He looked at her, and the defensiveness in his expression melted. You know I do not, he said. If I were thinking only of myself, I would stay, even if the whole station pointed at us in the street. But I have no right to drag you into scandal. My husband trusts me, she said, and for the first time there was in her voice a note that startled him, an intonation almost of bitterness. He took a step towards her, then checked himself. The hospital verandas were not deserted, and voices could be heard in the corridor. Meg, he said quietly, if I stay, we shall destroy something in you that I love more than anything, your honesty. You will become like those other women, sly, calculating, always watching yourself. I will not have that. Better that we should suffer now than rot slowly. She had not come prepared to plead. It was not in her nature to be theatrical. Yet something in his words struck at her pride. You are very generous, she said coldly. You would save my soul at the expense of my heart. He winced. I am trying to save what can be saved, he said. We cannot go on as we are. We are watched. It only needs an accident, someone to see us at the wrong moment, for everything to be ruined. If I go away now, everyone will think it is only a change of posting. You will be safe then. Safe, she repeated, and the word seemed to her suddenly the most desolate in the language. Safe, in the bungalow on the hill, with the club, the dinners, the long hot afternoons. Safe with Carstairs' quiet affection, with his conscientious reports, with his spotless collars. Safe and inwardly dead. She turned towards the door. If you wish to go, I cannot stop you, she said. But do not pretend that you do it for my sake. You do it because you are afraid. She left without waiting for his reply. That evening, when Carstairs came home, she was pale but composed. He told her as he ate some tedious story about a dispute over a boundary line. She listened with an attention she had not given him for months. Once he looked at her more closely than usual and asked if she were unwell. I have a headache, she said. The heat. He advised her to rest, and after dinner went to the club, where he played bridge until 11. Meanwhile, events were arranging themselves without the least regard for the feelings of the three persons concerned. The resident, an amiable but unimaginative man, had received a telegram announcing that a serious outbreak of fever had occurred in a district up the coast, and that an additional doctor was urgently required there. Being aware that Tanah Merah boasted 2 medical officers, he decided that the younger and more expendable of them should be sent. The official letter informing Ames of his transfer arrived the next day. In the morning, he had been resolved to ask for such a transfer. In the afternoon, after Meg's visit, he had been equally resolved to stay. Life, which has a sense of humor, thus spared him the necessity of choosing. He went up to the bungalow that evening with the letter in his pocket, feeling as a man might feel who goes to tell a friend that he has been sentenced and finds that the order is already signed. The sunset flamed behind the palms. The sea was smooth as oil. He found Meg on the veranda, the light from the drawing-room lamp falling on her face, making of it a pale oval. I am going, he said abruptly, without the preamble he had rehearsed. They are sending me to Batu Lintang. There's fever there. I shall leave in 3 days. For a moment she did not move. Then she said very quietly, So you are saved the trouble of making a decision. If you like, he answered, stung. It appears that fate has taken it out of my hands. He handed her the letter. She read it slowly, her lips pressed together. When she returned it, her fingers brushed his, and he noticed that they were cold. Will it be very dangerous? She asked. He shrugged. There is always some danger, he said. One takes precautions. It will be hard work, that's all. You will die, she said, with that unreasonable certainty which love lends to any gloomy prophecy. Men die everywhere, he answered. In Harley Street as well as in Batu Lintang. At least there one is doing something. Do you go gladly then? She demanded suddenly. Is it a relief to you to be carried away by events? To be able to leave me without having to say it is your own choice? You are unjust, he said. I would give anything to stay, but if I stay, what am I to do? Live in your doorway like a beggar, watch you day after day and not speak to you, sneak into your garden like a thief. Better a thief than a coward, she retorted. There was silence. Below them, the garden was already dark. The scent of frangipani rose heavy on the moist air. Somewhere in the distance, music drifted faintly from the club. Someone was playing a sentimental tune on the piano. Meg, he said at last, his voice low, if I asked you to come with me, what would you say? The question once put into the world seemed to hang there incredulously, as though even the air of the veranda, accustomed to wifely small talk, could not take it in. She stared at him. With you? She repeated. Leave my husband? Run away? Do you know what you are saying? Yes, he said. I know, it is madness. But is it more mad than this half-life we have been leading? In Batu Lintang I shall have a house, such as it is. You could come. We could be together openly for what that is worth, and let the world say what it likes. I'm not much of a match. I have no money to offer you, only myself. But if you would come, I would spend the rest of my life trying to make up to you for what you had lost. For a second her heart leapt with such violence that she felt almost faint. This, then, was the thing which, in the darkest corner of her mind, she had sometimes dreamed of and at once thrust away, as a child presses his face to the toy-shop window and then turns quickly lest the sight of the toys he cannot have should overwhelm him. To go away with him, to cut herself off at one stroke from everything she had known, to become in the eyes of the world a woman of a certain kind. These were consequences she had always regarded as belonging to other people's stories, not to her own life. She saw in a flash her father's lined, gentle face, the dismay of the aunt who had negotiated her marriage, the whispers in the vicarage drawing-room. She saw herself arriving years later in England, worn and shabby, and meeting on the promenade by chance some old acquaintance who would cut her deliberately. She saw also, with a clarity that made her shiver, the little house in Batu Lintang, the cheap furniture, the whitewashed walls, the heat and insects, and herself moving about it with a sense of purpose she had never known, cooking clumsily, laughing over her mistakes with Philip, sharing his anxieties over his patients, waiting for him in the evenings. It seemed to her that in his question the whole weight of her life had been placed upon a pair of scales, which trembled now before settling irrevocably. Say that you will come, he whispered. We have only one life, Meg. Let us not waste it. She could not answer at once. She rose and walked to the edge of the veranda, leaning on the rail. The sea was no more than a dark presence now, the horizon barely distinguishable from the sky. The palms stood motionless, their fronds blurred. Somewhere in the compound a dog barked. She had thought often in vague terms of some catastrophe that would release her. She had not imagined that the initiative might be hers. If she went with him, she sinned not only in the eyes of men, but in her own. All the lessons of duty, loyalty, self-effacement drummed in her ears, and yet they were no longer sufficient. She felt with a sudden lucidity that if she refused now, if she chose safety, if she condemned herself to the slow death of respectability, she would never forgive herself. She would become one of those dried women whose mouths are always pursed, whose eyes are hard, who live on their grievances. I will come, she said. The words, once uttered, gave her a strange, wild peace. She turned back towards him and saw that his face had altered. It was as if he had suddenly put on 10 years, so grave was his expression. You understand what it means? He asked. Yes, she said. I shall have to write to my father. I shall hurt him more than I can bear to think. I shall be spoken of as a woman with no morals. I shall probably never see England again. I shall live in wretched places, and my clothes will be dreadful. I shall be frightened of being ill because there will be no one else to look after you. And yet, she paused and smiled faintly, and yet I think I shall be alive. He took her in his arms then, and for a little while they forgot the world beyond the veranda. It was settled between them that she would leave with him on the small coastal steamer, which 3 days later was to take him to Batu Lintang. On the morning of his departure, she would invent some pretext for going down to the jetty, some charitable errand or shopping, She would bring with her a small suitcase containing only what she could not bear to leave behind. The rest would be left to fate. They parted that night with the solemnity of conspirators. As Ames went down the hill, his heart beating so fast that he could feel it in his throat, he was suddenly arrested by the sight of a figure standing in the shadow of the hibiscus. It was Davenant, who had come, as he sometimes did, to borrow a book from Carstairs. He had reached the veranda just as Meg and Ames had drawn apart, and had seen, in that instant before they composed their faces, something that gave him a shock. He was not at that time as old as he later became when he told me the story, but he was old enough in the ways of the world to know what such an expression meant. He stepped back instinctively into the shadow, not from any delicacy, but from the sheer habit of a man used to dealing with awkward situations. He waited until Ames had gone down the path, and then went up the steps, coughing loudly so as to announce his presence. Meg came to the door, her colour heightened, her movements a shade too rapid. "I came to see if Carstairs was at home," Davenant said. "There's a matter about the new peer I must discuss with him." "He's at the club," Meg answered. "He said he might be late. Can you not see him there?" "I will go round," Davenant said. He hesitated. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Carstairs?" he asked, with a frankness which was unusual in him. She stiffened. "Of course," she replied. "Why do you ask?" He looked at her for a moment. "You know that people talk a great deal in a small place," he said quietly. "They say foolish, unkind things. I should not like anything you did to give them cause." "I am not accustomed to having my actions supervised, Mr. Davenant," she said, the anger she felt towards herself and Ames transferring itself easily to him. "If you will excuse me, I have housework to attend to." She left him abruptly, and he, who had never possessed the art of saying the right thing at the right time, went away feeling clumsy and dissatisfied. Yet what he had seen, though fleeting, had fixed itself in his mind. In the days that followed, he watched the three of them with increasing uneasiness. Thus it was that when the morning came on which the steamer was to leave for Batu Lintang, more than one pair of eyes in Tanah Merah, each for its own reason, watched the road to the jetty. Chapter 5. The steamer was due to sail at 11, but long before that hour the little quay was already busy. Coolies moved about with their peculiar loping gait, balancing boxes and bundles on their shoulders. Chickens protested in wicker cages. Chinese merchants shouted instructions. The harbour master, immaculate in his white uniform, perspired discreetly under his helmet. The sun beat down pitilessly on the oily water, turning it to a sheet of dazzle. The sky was an unblemished blue. Ames, having finished his last hasty round at the hospital and handed over to his colleague, arrived at the quay with 2 small trunks and a black bag. He wore his best suit, which was not much the better for the climate, and in his pockets he had the sum of his worldly fortune, which was modest. He was conscious of an unreality in the scene, as though he were watching someone else go through the motions of departure. It was impossible to believe that in an hour he would be on his way to a new life, and that in that life the woman he loved would be with him. He had not seen Meg since the evening on the veranda. It had been agreed between them that this would be wiser. Every additional meeting increased the risk of remark. The arrangements had been simple. She would come down to the quay shortly before the steamer sailed in the carriage, ostensibly to see him off. At the last moment she would slip on board and the carriage would return empty. The servants would suppose that she had gone to the club or to some friend's house. By the time their mistake was discovered, the steamer would be far down the coast. That such a plan depended on half a dozen chances, any one of which might fail, they both knew, but there was no other. He stood on the jetty, looking up the road. Every white carriage that appeared in the distance made his heart leap and then sink again. The minutes passed. The harbour master consulted his watch and looked impatiently towards the bridge where the resident's car was just arriving. The resident, whose duty it was to come and see the departing doctor off with official politeness, descended, mopped his brow, and engaged Ames in desultory conversation about the epidemic at Batu Lintang. If he noticed the younger man's distraction, he put it down to natural nerves. 10 minutes to 11. The shrill whistle of the steamer sounded as steam was raised. A gangway clattered into place. Passengers began to go on board. A Chinese family laden with parcels shepherded two squalling children. A Malay trader in a white skullcap carried a brass-bound chest with the air of a man transporting all his earthly goods. Among them, the little figure of Davenant appeared briefly on the quay, then vanished as he went to speak to the harbour master. Ames's eyes never left the road. He was so intent that he did not at first see Carstairs. It was only when the resident greeted someone with unusual cordiality and he turned mechanically towards the sound that he saw his rival at his elbow. Carstairs wore his customary neat suit. His face was a little flushed from the heat and from the effort of walking down from the office. He shook hands with Ames with that same dry politeness which had marked their relations from the beginning. "I'm sorry to be late," he said. "There was some troublesome business about a land survey. I could not get away earlier. I wanted to wish you good luck, Dr. Ames." "Thank you," Ames muttered. His mind in a lightning flash took in the implications. If Carstairs was here, where was Meg? Had she told him? Had something happened at the bungalow? Had her courage failed? He felt an almost uncontrollable impulse to seize Carstairs by the lapels and shout questions into his face. Instead, he stood rigid, his hands clenched at his sides. "You will have your work cut out for you at Batu Lintang," the resident was saying. "The fever there is no joke, but I have no doubt you'll manage. Young men like you are what the service needs. We old stagers are played out." The words fell meaninglessly. Somewhere a clock struck the quarter. "We had better not delay the captain too long," the harbour master murmured respectfully. The resident turned to Ames. "Well, goodbye, my dear fellow," he said. "Write, and let us know how you get on. If there is anything you need, don't hesitate to ask. We'll do what we can from this end. Carstairs, you might spare him a thought when you're sitting comfortably in your office." They laughed, the easy laugh of men who have never had to choose between passion and duty. The gangway rattled again. "All aboard!" someone called. It was at that moment that Meg's carriage appeared at the bend in the road. Ames saw it first. The sight struck him like a blow. The horses came on at a steady trot, the driver in his. Turban flicked them absently with the whip. The sun shone on the hood. He could not at first see whether anyone was inside. Your wife has come too," the resident said to Carstairs. "Very proper. It is always pleasant for a man to feel that he will be missed." Carstairs shaded his eyes with his hand. "So she has," he said. "I told her there was no need. The sun is infernal at this hour, but she's obstinate when she has set her mind on anything. Like all women." There was mild amusement in his tone. The carriage drew up at the edge of the quay. The driver leapt down and held the door. Meg descended, very pale, but otherwise composed. She wore a simple white dress and a hat with a ribbon that fluttered in the slight breeze from the water. For a second her eyes met Ames's, and in that second it seemed to him that the whole quay with its noise and bustle receded, leaving only the two of them in a kind of terrible clarity. Then Carstairs stepped forward. "You are just in time," he said cheerfully. "You nearly missed the doctor." She gave him her hand. "I was delayed," she answered. "The boy mislaid my gloves." "We were beginning to fear you would not come," the resident said gallantly. She smiled a little mechanical smile which deceived him completely. "I could not let Dr. Ames go away without saying goodbye," she said. "He has been very kind to me at the hospital." The four of them stood there for a moment, exchanging the banalities which convention requires on such occasions. Ames replied as best he could, feeling that his lips were stiff and that he was speaking some language that did not belong to him. He was aware that one false move, one phrase too warm, one glance too eloquent, would betray them. Yet the very effort to appear natural made him stiff. "We must not keep the captain waiting," the harbour master said again, more insistently. The resident shook Ames's hand once more. Carstairs followed suit. "Take care of yourself," he said. "And write if you find that the sanitation there is as bad as they say. I dare say we can get some funds for improvements." Then he stepped back. The gangway clanged. "Goodbye," Meg said. She held out her hand. For the fraction of a second, her fingers tightened on his with a pressure that to anyone watching would have seemed no more than the ordinary nervousness of a woman seeing a friend depart. To Ames it was an appeal, a command, a farewell all at once. In her eyes he read the answer to the question that had filled his mind since he had seen Carstairs on the quay. She would not come. Whether the failure were of courage, of opportunity, or of something in her which he had never understood, he did not know then and never fully knew. He only realized, with a clarity that was almost relief, that the step they had planned would not be taken. "Goodbye," he said. He went up the gangway without looking back. The steamer's deck was hot under his feet. He took his place by the rail among the other passengers. Below, the little group on the quay stood in a patch of blinding sunlight. The bell rang. A hoarse shout went up. The water churned as the propeller began to turn. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the gap between the steamer and the quay widened. The figures on the shore grew smaller. Meg lifted her hand again in a last wave. He responded mechanically. Then the quay was behind them. The harbour opened out. The town, with its white club and its line of shophouses, receded, grew indistinct. The journey to Batu Lintang, in the end, was less dramatic than the farewells that had preceded it. The fever he had been sent to combat proved stubborn but manageable. He worked hard, learned to improvise with inadequate equipment, quarreled with the local officials, bullied the apothecary, and slept sometimes from sheer exhaustion. In the intervals, however, when the nights were too hot for sleep and the jungle hummed outside like a vast, hidden engine, he thought of the quay and the white figure that had not moved when the gangway was raised. At first he was bitter. He accused her, in his thoughts, of cowardice, of having used him to enliven her boredom and then abandoning him when the price became too high. Then, little by little, the bitterness faded. He remembered the vicarage, the father, the aunt. He remembered Carstairs' orderly, decent existence, the way he straightened papers on his desk, the carefulness with which he spoke. It seemed to him that what they had both attempted to do was to break not only with individuals, but with a whole system of values in which they were more deeply enmeshed than they had known. He recognized at last the magnitude of what he had asked of her. Whether he forgave her entirely, I do not know. Men forgive more readily than women suppose, partly because their pride shrinks from being seen to suffer too long. Meanwhile, in Tanah Merah, life resumed its course. For a day or two the station buzzed with conjecture. It is a favorite occupation of such places to take the most innocent events and arrange them into suggestive patterns. In this case, however, fate had been oddly indulgent. The very fact that Meg had accompanied her husband to the quay, openly and properly, served to allay suspicion. The women, who had come prepared to enjoy a scandal, found themselves cheated of their entertainment. It is true that one or two of them remarked that Mrs. Carstairs had seemed a trifle pale, but they attributed this to the heat. Carstairs himself, if he had any inkling of what had almost occurred, did not betray it. He came home that day in good humour, spoke of the doctor's prospects in Batu Lintang, and praised him as a good chap. Meg, listening, felt as though she stood on the edge of a precipice which she alone could see. She moved about the house, superintending the servants, arranging flowers, directing the laying of the table, accomplishing all the small, tedious tasks she had always done, and yet it seemed to her that she was performing them for the first time as a conscious impostor. At night, when she lay beside her husband, she was overwhelmed by the proximity of the body she had almost betrayed. Once, in those first days, she came near to telling him everything. He had had a vexatious day at the office and was cross. He complained about the inefficiency of a clerk, about the resident's obtuseness, with an irritability rare in him. "I sometimes wonder why I go on," he said. "One works and no one notices. Perhaps I should chuck it all and go home." The phrase, spoken lightly, struck her with a curious pain. Here he was, talking half in jest of the very renunciation she had failed to make. He was prepared in some weary moment to give up for nothing what she had been ready to throw away for love. It crossed her mind that if she told him, he might indeed take her away. They might begin again somewhere else, in some obscure corner of England where the scandal would never penetrate. "Edward," she said suddenly, "if I had done something very wrong, what would you say?" He looked up from his pipe with surprise. "Wrong? What do you mean?" "Suppose," she went on, forcing herself, "that I had cared perhaps too much for someone else. Suppose I had thought of going away with him and then not gone. Would that be wrong?" He stared at her, his mild eyes rounding. Then he laughed. "What romantic nonsense you talk sometimes," he said. "Too many novels, my dear. You must not imagine that life is like that. Such things do not happen in real life, or at least not in decent circles. And if, say, you had a foolish fancy for someone, well, you are human, I suppose. As long as you did nothing about it. I should never know, and it would not matter. We all have our little ebullitions. I came quite near to being in love with a girl in Cheltenham once before we married. It was of no consequence." He puffed at his pipe. "When you are older, you will see things differently. You will realize that stability is the only thing that counts." She was silent. He had, in his blundering way, given her absolution without knowing that there was anything to absolve. But the absolution cost her dear, for in that moment she saw that, for him, her feelings, if ever they strayed, belonged to the category of little ebullitions, trivial disturbances which did not touch the serious structure of life. To confess to him would therefore be not so much to seek forgiveness as to impart information he might have preferred not to receive. She could hurt him, but she could not thereby change him. She held her peace. Of what passed then, in the privacy of her heart, Davenant could only guess when, years later, she spoke of it to him. What he did know was this, that from that time onward Meg became more evidently than before the kind of woman the station approved. She was kind to the other wives. She took an interest in bazaars and in the mission school. She played the piano badly but willing at their gatherings, and she never gave the faintest opportunity for gossip. If she suffered, she did so quietly. Ames in Batu Lintang continued his work. He married eventually, not very happily, a girl who came out as a nurse. It is not given to many men to live out more than one great passion. Most of us must content ourselves with the memory of what might have been. Chapter 6. I have brought the story forward in time with the briskness of a man leafing through a file, but life itself is not so economical. Years pass with tedious exactitude while the positions of the players alter by barely a step. The service moves them like pieces on a draft board, from Tanah Merah to Kota Baru, from there to some inland district and back to the capital, and all the while the same letters are written, the same complaints uttered, the same small hopes cherished and let go. Carstairs, who had once thought of resigning, remained in his post. His conscientiousness was too deeply ingrained to allow him to abandon a duty he had undertaken. He was given the customary promotions at the customary intervals. He went on leave every 5 years, spent 6 months in England, returned, always with the same faint relief at leaving the damp behind. Meg accompanied him, dutifully visiting her father in the vicarage, being admired, pitied, and envied by the women she had grown up among, who regarded her as a person who had escaped the limitations of their existence, and yet felt obscurely that she had paid too much for her escape. They never guessed that she looked at them sometimes with a kind of wistfulness, envying them the very stability which bored them. I saw her once in those years, though I did not learn then who she was. It was at a dinner in Singapore. She sat opposite me, a slim woman in a simple black dress, her hair lightly touched with grey at the temples. She said little. When she did speak, it was with a softness that made one bend forward to listen. I remember noticing her hands. They had the slight coarsening that comes to women who have had to manage servants who are less capable than they should be. Beside her sat a man with a neat moustache who spoke in measured tones about irrigation. It was only later, when Henry reminded me, that I realized I had seen the Carstairs together. Time, which had not been unkind to her in appearance, had nevertheless planted in her expression a certain restraint. She had, if I may put it so, the air of a person who has accepted once and for all that she will not get her heart's desire and has resolved to make the best of what she can have. There is a dignity in such resignation, but also a tragedy which those who have never wanted anything very much are unable to perceive. The final act of the story took place after they had gone home for good. Carstairs retired with the rank his superiors thought he deserved, and with a pension his wife thought inadequate. They took a small house in a dull suburb of London, near enough to a park for them to walk in it when the weather permitted. There they lived, as so many retired officials do, in a curious half-life between the country they had left and the one to which they had returned. They read the newspapers, visited occasionally their relations, dined once a year with the colonial office at a large gathering of similarly displaced persons, and talked endlessly of the East. In their street, they were known as those people who have been abroad. The neighbours found Meg a trifle aloof, not understanding that she had simply forgotten how to enter with ease into the preoccupations of people whose chief complaint was the unreliability of the milkman. Thus arranged, they might have jogged on for years, had not Carstairs, whose health had always been excellent, died unexpectedly one winter after a brief bout of pneumonia. He passed, I am told, with exemplary tidiness, having set his papers in order and instructed his solicitor to see that Meg should be comfortable. She was not of the sort to rend her garments. Her grief was quiet, sincere, and curiously free from rebellion. When I returned to England after my last journey in the East, sometime after Carstairs' death, I found one day among my letters a note from Henry Davenant. He too had at last settled in London, in a small flat in a street which smelt permanently of gas and boiled cabbage. He had grown thicker in the body and more irritable. The damp made his rheumatism troublesome. He asked me to call, and when I did so, he greeted me with that mixture of joviality and complaint which men of action often develop in their retirement. "I am seeing ghosts everywhere," he said. "The East follows one like a bad debt. I thought perhaps talking about it would exercise it. Besides, there is someone I want you to meet. You remember the Carstairs I told you of that night in Singapore?" "Vaguely," I said. I had not forgotten the story. A writer is like a man with a bag in which he stores other people's confidences until he finds a use for them. "The husband is dead," he continued. "The wife is in London. She is a cousin of my sister's husband or something of the sort. I have seen her, once or twice. She knows that I know, you understand. She has never spoken of it, but there is something in her manner that suggests she might. I thought if you met her, you might get the end of the story." He smiled wryly. "I dare say it is a professional curiosity on my part as well." He arranged that I should be invited to tea on a certain afternoon. The house was in a quiet street not far from the park. It was one of those red brick villas with bay windows which London has produced in such numbers. There were lace curtains, geraniums on the sill, a knocker polished by habit. Meg received us in a small sitting room whose furniture was of a kind that makes one morally tired. Everything was plush, curved, fussy, as though the upholsterer had wished to compensate for the plainness of the life lived among his products. On the mantelpiece stood a few bits of Eastern china, incongruous among the brass ornaments. She herself had altered less than the years would justify. Her hair was now frankly grey, but her figure was still slight. There was a touch of colour in her cheeks which suggested that she had been out for a brisk walk. She greeted me with the slight formality of a woman who has not wholly lost the shyness of the provincial girl she had been. Only when Henry mentioned, with his usual lack of tact, that I had travelled much and knew the East well, did she show animation. "Then you will understand," she said. "Most people here think it remarkable that I should have lived so long without as much as learning to make jam." We laughed, and the ice was broken. We spoke, as such people always do, of old times, of the stations where we had been, of the clubs, the officials, the ridiculous incidents which acquire in recollection a charm they never possessed in reality. She talked of Tanamera, of the hospital, of Davenant's awkwardness when he had to make a speech at the opening of the new pier. She spoke of her husband with respect, even with affection. There was no bitterness in her tone. Only once, when she mentioned his death, did her voice tremble. "He worked too hard," she said. "He never spared himself, and he did not care for doctors. He always said that a man ought to die when his time came without making a fuss." When tea was over, Henry rose, muttering something about a call he had to make. I saw the maneuver and was not sure I approved of it. It is not always kind to leave two people alone in the hope that one of them will confide. Yet I cannot deny that my curiosity was whetted. Meg made no attempt to detain him. She accompanied him to the door and then returned, took up some knitting, and sat by the window. There was a brief silence. Outside, the street was grey and damp. A costermonger's cart rattled past. "Mr. Davenant said you had once known my husband," she remarked at last. "From a distance," I answered. "I remember dining with you in Singapore many years ago. You would not recall it. There were a good many people there. But I have heard of him often from Henry. He admired him greatly. Henry is a good man, she said. Clumsy, but good. She knitted for a few moments, the needles clicking softly. He knows a good deal more than most people, she added quietly. It seemed to me that the moment for discretion had passed. He told me something of what happened, I said. He spoke of a friendship between you and a doctor. I watched her face. She did not start. Only her hands paused for the fraction of a second. He had no right, she said, but there was no anger in her tone. No one has the right to tell another person's story, and yet I cannot resent it. There are times when one would like one's life to make sense to someone, if only to convince oneself that it had not been altogether foolish. She laid the knitting on her lap and looked out of the window. The light, such as it was, fell on her profile, emphasizing the line from the corner of her nostril to the mouth. It was a line that spoke not of bitterness, but of a certain controlled irony. I suppose he told you that I behaved badly, she went on. That would be the natural conclusion. It is quite true. I did behave badly. I betrayed my husband in thought, if not in deed, though there was that as well. I allowed another man to love me, and I loved him. That is the plain truth. There is nothing very original about it. He told me that you meant to go away together and that at the last minute you did not, I said. He did not know why. Nor do I, she said. Not really. If you were to ask me for a reason that would satisfy a moralist, I could not give you one. I was ready to go. I had even packed a small case. I had written a letter to my father which I never sent. I had thought over all the consequences, at least so far as anyone can foresee. The consequences of an act which breaks entirely with one's past. I had weighed them against what I felt for Philip, that was his name, and for a while the balance had inclined in his favor. Then on the morning itself, as I was about to get into the carriage, I saw my husband's stick standing in the corner of the hall. It was a foolish, ordinary thing, with a crooked handle. I had seen it every day for years without noticing it. That morning it seemed to stand for everything that my life with him had been. Dull, perhaps, but secure, founded on decency, on a notion of honor that was narrow but sincere. I realized suddenly that if I went, I did not merely choose one man instead of another. I chose also to destroy something in myself that I had always taken for granted. It is easy to call such scruples cowardice. Perhaps they are. I only know that I could not take that step. I went to the quay and I watched the steamer go. I saw his face on the deck and I knew that I was the worst kind of coward, the kind who allows another person to risk everything on her behalf and then draws back. I have lived with that knowledge ever since. Was it cowardice? I asked. Or only a recognition that the price was too high? Is there a difference? She said, turning to me with a faint smile. We tell ourselves that there is in order to sleep at night. I have told myself many things. I have said that if I had gone with him, I should have made him unhappy. I am not an easy person to live with. I have said that my husband would have suffered intolerably, and that my father would have died of shame. All that is true. It does not alter the other truth, that I had not the courage to seize the one chance of passion that life offered me. Did your husband ever know? I asked. She looked down at her hands. He knew something, she said. He knew that I was attached to Philip in a way that went beyond mere friendliness. He was not a stupid man, though people sometimes took him for one. He asked me once, in a roundabout way, whether I had ever felt tempted to wander, he called it. I told him that there had been a moment when I had nearly done something very wrong and that I had not done it. He said that in that case there was nothing to discuss. He considered the matter settled. For him, the line lay not between feeling and feeling, but between feeling and action. He was right, from his point of view. But there are actions we commit inwardly that leave more lasting scars than anything we do with our hands. And the doctor, I ventured. Did you ever see him again? Once, she said. Many years later. We were home on leave and staying in a boarding house in Devonshire, of all places. It was raining, as it always does in Devonshire. I was in the lounge after dinner, with a book I was not reading, when the door opened and he came in. He was stouter, his hair was thinning. He had grown a moustache which did not suit him. He wore an ill-fitting suit. For a second we simply stared at one another. Then we did the only thing we could do. We behaved as acquaintances. We talked about the weather, about the food, about the other guests. My husband joined us. I introduced them. I sat between them and thought, if things had been different, I might now be mending Philip's socks instead of your shirts. It was an absurd thought. I have never mended socks in my life, but it seemed to symbolize what I had not chosen. When he left, he shook hands with me and said nothing particular. I never saw him again. Later, I heard that he had married. She picked up her knitting once more, though she did not resume her work. When my husband died, she went on, I expected that I should feel a great release. I thought, now I am free to regret nothing. But grief has a way of confusing one's accounts. Instead of feeling liberated, I found that I mourned not only him, but the woman he had thought me to be, and the woman I had once thought myself to be. I was left with the woman I am. She is not a very impressive person. You are too harsh on yourself, I said. You chose as most of us choose. You tried to do the least harm. That it did harm to yourself is another matter. She looked at me appraisingly. You write, do you not? She said. Henry told me. You live off other people's lives, as it were. I do not say this to reproach you. If no one wrote, we would have only our own stories, and most of us are too cowardly to examine them closely. If you ever use this story, be kind to us. Do not make us into monsters or angels. We were only ordinary people who wanted more than we had and were afraid to take it. If I write it at all, I said, I shall try to tell it as you have told it, without excuses and without condemnation. She smiled then, a smile which, for a moment, recalled the girl she must once have been. That would be more mercy than we deserve, she said. But perhaps mercy, like love, is something one must accept without deserving it. Henry returned shortly afterwards, full of some trivial complaint about the bus service. We spoke no more of the matter. When I took my leave, she shook hands with me with a calmness which suggested that, for her, the conversation had been not an upheaval, but an arrangement of papers long left in disorder. As I walked away down the dull London street, past the grey houses with their polished brass and their curtains, I thought of the bungalow that no longer stood on the hill at Tanah Merah, of the veranda from which she had watched the steamer go, of the stick leaning in the hall. It seemed to me that we are most truly ourselves, not in the bold acts by which others judge us, but in the moments when, unseen, we step back from the edge. The world will never know how many such acts of retreat have shaped its course. Chapter 7. When I had finished his story, for in the end it seemed to me that it was as much Henry's tale as mine, he emptied his glass and sat for a moment looking at the little patch of darkness where the bungalow had once stood. The harbour was very quiet. A faint breeze from the sea had sprung up, stirring the leaves of the flame trees. Somewhere in the garden a night bird called. You see, he said, why I told you that I doubted whether any of us behaves well when pushed too hard. They were all three in a way honourable people. The man out there, he jerked his head vaguely towards the invisible coast, did what he thought was right according to his lights. The woman did what she could. The doctor, poor devil, did what was expected of him professionally and made a mess of his private life. There are no villains, unless one counts the ladies at the club. He gave a short laugh. And yet I have sometimes wondered whether the only really decent one of the three was the fellow who knew least. Carstairs plodded on, did his work, trusted his wife, died in harness. He never demanded from life more than it was prepared to give him. Perhaps that is the only way to manage decently. You seem to forget that he suffered too, I said. He may have known more than you suppose. People are not as blind as we like to think. Perhaps, Henry admitted. He was not a fool, I grant you. But if he knew, he behaved very well, which is more than I can say for the rest of us. I have not always behaved well myself. He stubbed out his cigar with unnecessary energy. We like to imagine, you and I, that we are detached observers, he went on. We tell ourselves that we sit on the veranda and watch the drama in the compound without taking part. It is not true. We are mixed up with it whether we like it or not. I might have intervened, you know. I might have gone to Carstairs when I first suspected, told him plainly what was going on, forced the issue, or I might have spoken more seriously to her, frightened her perhaps into giving the fellow up. I did nothing. I watched. Not because I am tolerant, as I sometimes pretend, but because I was curious. I wanted to see how it would turn out. It makes one's blood run cold when one thinks of the harm that has been done in this world by people who were merely curious. You give yourself too much importance, I said. These things would have come about whether you watched them or not. You did not invent passion or fear. No, he said, but I could have given them a nudge. That may not sound much, but when you have lived as long as I have, you know that a nudge at the right moment can alter the direction of a life. He paused. Perhaps that is what you do in your books, he added. You arrange the nudges. You make us all wiser than we were and more interesting than we deserved. You leave out the long stretches of boredom and pettiness. That is your privilege. I envy you. You think I shall use this? I asked. You know you will, he said with a dry smile. That is why I told you. I am too old now to pretend that my motives are wholly disinterested. I wanted to put it somewhere, to have it exist outside my own head. It has rattled about there long enough. The punkah creaked. The shadows on the lawn grew deeper. A faint mist gathered over the water, blurring the lights of the anchored ships. The club behind us murmured with voices and the clink of glasses. For a time we sat in silence, each occupied with his own thoughts. On the far shore where the bungalow had stood, there was now, I am told, a row of cement houses used as garages or go-downs. The bougainvillea was long since uprooted, the veranda rail torn down. The sea still beat against the land at high tide, indifferent to the fates of men and women whose passions had once flared there as briefly as phosphorescence in the wake of a boat. When at last I rose to go, Henry accompanied me to the steps. You will write it, he said. In your own way, of course. You will change the names and perhaps move the place. It does not matter. Only don't make it too edifying. Life isn't. I don't think there is much danger of that, I answered. As I walked back to the hotel, the heavy scent of frangipani thick in the still air, I thought of Meg in her London sitting room, of Ames in his provincial surgery perhaps, of Carstairs in some neat grave with its correct headstone. I thought, too, of the countless other men and women whose lives had turned on moments as unremarkable to outward appearance as the sight of a stick in a hall or a steamer leaving a quay. If one were to tell all those stories, perhaps the world would be more inclined to pity and less eager to judge. But we tell only a few, and even of those we tell less than the whole truth, partly because we do not know it and partly because we are ourselves implicated. It may be that one day, in some other harbour, another man will look towards a vanished house and remember some tale of love and cowardice he has witnessed, and will seek out someone who writes to relieve himself of it. We are, each of us, in turn, actors and spectators, penitent and judge. For my part, as I lay that night under the slow swinging of the punkah and listened to the sea breathing beyond the garden, I found myself thinking less of who had behaved well or ill than of the fragility of the arrangements by which we seek to shelter ourselves from chance. A stick in a hall, a letter mislaid, a carriage delayed by a boy who cannot find a pair of gloves. Such are the straws on which our moral edifices rest. If there is any lesson in the story of the bungalow on the hill, it is not that we should be more virtuous. We are as virtuous as our strength allows. It is rather that, knowing how weak we are, we should be slower to condemn those who have not chosen as we did, and more grateful for the accidents that have saved us from being found out.